Okay, everyone, welcome to episode 4 of Coffee Car Chats with Caitlin. This is another solo episode, and so I think personally solo episodes, except for the very first one, because I had a lot to say, solo episodes are going to be shorter in terms of time, just because I feel like if I don't have someone to have a conversation with, I typically can only ramble but for so long on a screen. Needless to say, the coffee we have today is, I'm being a basic bee today. I got Dunkin'. And from Dunkin', I got a iced original coffee with caramel swirl and pink velvet swirl with oat milk. I rate this a 10 out of 10, y'all. I absolutely love this drink. I get so sad when they take pink velvet off the menu after Valentine's Day. I am a pink velvet and brownie battered donut stan. All of that being said, today's topic is growing up Catholic, which, if you didn't know, I grew up Catholic. I still consider myself Catholic, even though I don't go to church as much as my grandparents would probably like me to. I don't even have an excuse, if I'm being honest, especially since I'm unemployed. I'm really just digging myself a hole here. Okay, intro. So, growing up Catholic. Catholic kids by the numbers, because I felt like this would best encapsulate how many other people may relate to growing up Catholic. Catholic kids by the numbers. This is via AmericaMagazine.com. According to the report, The State of Religion and Young People, Catholics make up roughly 1/5 of the population 13 to 25-year-olds in the United States, which I feel like has gone down. I don't know, I haven't done enough research, which is on me for not doing it before this episode, but I feel like that has gone down since I was a kid. I feel like it was significantly more, but I feel like a lot of people now are agnostic or atheist. I feel like that has kind of gone up in popularity in terms, where I feel like as a kid it wasn't that common to hear someone was agnostic. But anyways, besides the point. Nearly 1/3 of young Catholics say they do not think it's important to have a faith community. About 24% claim to be Catholic but say they are not religious. 34% attend religious services only once a year or less. And about 1/4 of young Catholics say they don't try to live out their religious beliefs in their daily life. So I will admit that as of right now, I am what a lot of Catholics consider a C&E Catholic, a Christmas and Easter Catholic. I do wish I went more, admittedly, but I just haven't, and I have, again, like I said earlier, I have no excuse. I just really should hold myself accountable to that, so I guess this video is me holding myself accountable in a way, if you want to say that. So let's continue on. So those are the only two by the numbers areas, but I thought this episode would be really fun to give you all some story times about growing up Catholic. I'm not going to get into my dad's stories or my brother's stories or my cousin's stories, which they have a lot as well, because my dad and all of my cousins on my dad's side actually went to Catholic school, K through 12. Meanwhile, my brother and I went to public school. So I feel like that you get a lot more stories about growing up Catholic when you go to a Catholic private school, which many of them being certain things that you do. I'll actually tell one, and I hope if she ever listens to this, she doesn't get mad that I tell this story, but one of the parts of graduation, of a Catholic school graduation that I went to when I was a senior in high school myself, was actually my friend. She graduated from a local Catholic private school, and they had this time where they did this dance in the, I don't want to call it an audience, but around their family and friends, with this like rope, if you will. It was like a chant that they also did at the same time. It was very odd. admittedly, it was very odd. It was giving cult. But in the best way possible, because if she ever reached out to me, I still have all the love in my heart for her. It just admittedly was a very odd experience to be sitting in on when you have never been to a Catholic private school graduation ever in your life, especially an all-girls Catholic private school. And she admitted that there were also very, very many other things that were weird about that private school and things that they did. So that is the only story time I'm going to tell outside of my own story times, because I experienced it myself. With my own two eyes, I mean. So here are some other story times. The main one being, actually I'm going to tell them in terms of as I grew up. I was going to tell them in terms of most popular, but I'm going to tell them in terms of how I grew up. So the first one is actually from my first confession. So before I get into anything, growing up Catholic, you have a lot of firsts. So you have first confession, you have your baptism, you have first communion. Obviously, I was baptized when I was like a newborn, so I don't have any stories about that. Actually, I do have stories about, I'm a godmother, so yet another reason why I should be going to Mass more. By the way, when people say going to church for Catholic, it means going to Mass. I admittedly should be going to Mass more, especially if I'm a godmother. But that one was very interesting because she was born in 2020, so her baptism was in 2021. And it was very interesting because, like, basically everyone else had to be masked except for me, the godfather, who is my cousin, the birth parents, and obviously the baby, my goddaughter, and the priest. Besides that, everyone else basically had to be masked up. And we were the only ones who were in the main part of the church. Everyone else was basically pushed to the very back, like they weren't allowed to get in but so far, which I know it was different all across the country during COVID, what was allowed where, just because of state mandates. But in Virginia, at least in Northern Virginia, they tried their best to be pretty strict about it. But so that wasn't that weird of a story or funny of a story, but I promise all these other ones are. So my very first confession. So my first confession, I could not tell you how old I was. I was definitely under the age of 7 because I was 7 when I had my first communion. But people always told me about how during my first confession, they kept on laughing because I got the priest, the father. And so I am, I'll be honest with this one. I'll give a name, because I'll call him Father Mike throughout this. Father Mike basically was there for every single one of my, not commandments. Wow, I look like such a bad Catholic right now. Father Mike was there for every single one of my big chapters in life. Literally, he was there up until my confirmation. And then he was put into a forced retirement, which I won't get into because my family was personally mad enough about that we actually left that church and went to another church, because they forced him into early retirement. Which he didn't do anything bad. People just thought he needed to retire. Admittedly, his masses were about an hour and 20 minutes long when every single other visiting father had about an hour long mass at max. But Father Mike, you knew that if he was the priest, you weren't getting out there earlier than an hour, 20 minutes. But so I had Father Mike for my first confession, and apparently I was telling him every single little thing I had ever done wrong. So my innocent, 5 or 6 year old self was telling Father Mike, all these things I had done wrong in the world. And he just looked at me and he said, "You know, you don't need to admit everything, right?" My parents and my brother fully went through their confession and were done. and they were seen after me by other fathers, by other deacons. And it was just so funny because they were like, man, what is taking Kaylin so long? And Father Mike, I do think he had a soft spot for me in particular, because he knew that I was just a very pure soul. Like, I wasn't trying to get his attention. I just was like, wanted to admit everything if I was supposed to admit things I did wrong. And so then following this is my first communion oopsie, is what I like to call it. So my parents may actually hate me for sharing this on the internet, but I actually took First Communion before I was supposed to. So backstory for taking communion before I was supposed to. I was allowed to try, like, they call it the body of Christ. I was allowed to try a piece of that in my grandparents' home. And so I thought, oh, okay, well, I've already had it, so I can have it again, but at church. That's just how my 7-year-old brain put 2 and 2 together. Until my brother completely tattled on me in the pew. The second that my parents got back in the pew, he completely tattled on me. And I do think that is just absolutely hilarious, because my parents were like, we do not tell this to Grandmommy and Granddaddy. But of course they have heard the story since. I'm not telling it, and they have never heard it. Like, they actually heard it, I think, a few years later. Because my parents were like, well, that actually is kind of funny, because it's like, you can't take everything super serious, especially when a 7-year-old does it. Like, say a 12-year-old does it, okay, you're at that age where you know you're not supposed to be taking communion before you've been given that right by the church. But like, when a 7-year-old does it, you're just kind of like, yeah, you can't really be mad about that. So that was one of my biggest oopsies in the church, at least. And again, we didn't tell my grandparents for a few years, but they know now, and they primarily being my granddaddy, but he finds that story still hilarious to this day. Because again, it's like, how are you going to get mad at a 7-year-old for that? And so the next one, which will take up the most time in this episode, is my confirmation retreat. So one of the next biggest things when you're a growing up Catholic is when you're getting confirmed, it basically means that you are seen as an adult in the eyes of the church, and you are fully committed to the church as an adult. You committed yourself to Catholicism in a way. Just speaking specifically religion. And so I was very serious at this time, because I think it was my sophomore year. Yeah, it was my sophomore year. So in my sophomore year is when I was going through my confirmation. And it's a year-long process. You have to go to all these Sunday school things, both during the day and at night, and at least for my church. And you also have to do these readings and basically come back with, like, your own homework in a way. Just like you have homework for school, you have homework for confirmation, to prove that you are committed to the church. And so a little bit of backstory is that I was very serious in competition dance at around this time. I was a sophomore, so I had a solo on top of being a part of a small group piece on top of my 3 other competitive dances of tap, jazz, and contemporary. So I was in 5 different dances, so competition was a really big thing, and it would have been like huge if I couldn't go to the competition because of a confirmation retreat. Especially just because of the money that you put into competition dance, which I could get into a whole separate episode about the finances that it takes for competition dance. But so what I was what I'm getting to is I had a lot of friends that were also going through confirmation, but at a different church local to us. So I basically got the A-OK from my church and from the other church to go to their confirmation retreat. So instead of being the lone soldier at my own church, I went with 6 other girls that went to my dance studio who were also going to a confirmation retreat. So they had 7 dancers who were going to this retreat. So obviously they couldn't have a dance competition on that weekend. And so this confirmation retreat, I was already towing the line, if you will, in terms of adult Catholics seeing that I was going to a different retreat than my own church. It was held at a convent in the woods. And when I say that, I am fully serious. Like, we did not have any service. There was nothing around us. Like, absolutely nothing. It took about an hour to get there. And the whole entire hour we were going down these long winding roads. So already very, very creepy vibes. Especially because, like, the best way I can explain this convent is, like, think of a really big church with dorm rooms, and a cafeteria. That's what this convent was. Because obviously if it was a convent before, nuns stayed there, so they had to have a place to sleep. And where we slept, there were 5 beds to one room, so it was a pretty big room. And so they basically made adjustments so that I could stay with some of my dance friends, since I didn't know anyone else, because a lot of this is about also finding other people your age who are committing themselves to the Catholic Church. And so so literally, I kid you not, confirmation retreat, like, first thing in the morning, you go to church, midday, you go to church, right before dinner, you have, like, another reading, and basically go to church a third time that day. Like, you were going to church 24/7 within that long weekend. And in between, if you're not eating, you're having these small group meetings where you talk about the pieces that were just read and how it relates to what you're currently going through. By the way, this is very random, but they had a cutout of the Pope, and my friends and I thought it was the funniest thing ever, so we actually took a picture with the cutout of the Pope. Again, completely random, but we just thought it was the funniest thing ever, because literally every single time you went to church, he was holding his hand up like this, so we would high five him every single time we were going on the way to I'm blanking on the word, the chapel, not chapel, you know what I mean. So I'm telling all this to get you all to one of the crazier parts of the story time of my weekend long retreat. So towards the end of this retreat, I have to sneeze and it's not coming. I'm going to take a sip of coffee. So towards the end of this retreat, you had a great confession where you're basically confessing any things that you feel like may be holding you back from actually committing yourself to the Catholic Church and being seen as an adult in the eyes of the church. And so this was very odd because we had working electricity this whole entire time. But when we entered for this great confession, if you will, the whole entire room was lit by candles. And basically we were told we weren't allowed to talk. We had to get in prayer stance. So basically you could have been sitting or kneeling, but you had to be in prayer stance. and you had to be praying to God or thinking of the things that you were going to bring up to the priest that were holding you back from being confirmed. And so basically it was like very serious, and it was very scary looking back on it, because it's like I was literally in this room with a bunch of other people aged 14 to 16, and all these nuns were watching over us, basically making sure we didn't talk. And like there were 3 different priests, I think. And you were tapped on a shoulder whenever the priest was ready to see you, and you were taken to a different room. And this is where it gets super funny, in my opinion, because I go into this room, right? This room, I would say it's no larger than literally the inside of my car. And the priest is sitting down on the ground, and you're supposed to sit on the ground, down on the ground across from him. And there's one singular candle in between you two. And he's looking down like this, but he's looking up at you. And he's like, he literally says to me, "Are you prepared to devote your life to God and to Jesus Christ and the church?" And it's like, I feel like I am about to enter a cult. Like, this is no hate on the Catholic Church, especially if my godparents or my goddaughter wouldn't be watching this, or anyone in my life is watching this. This is no hate on the Catholic Church. It's just how I felt in that moment. I felt like it was one of the most weird experiences in my life. Like, I felt so uncomfortable because it's like just the way that the priest said it. And then I was like, yeah, I guess. Like, I mean, I'm pretty committed to dance, but, and he's like, well, yeah, you got your own personal hobbies. And I'm like, okay, why'd you have to ask it that serious then? Like, you were making it sound like I was about to be, like, taken away. Like, again, that was just a very odd experience. Honestly, my confirmation retreat felt like a fever dream, especially since it was basically in a convent in the middle of the woods. It was basically the biggest setup for a horror movie you could ever think of. And of course, we had all the stereotypical things that I feel like retreats for young teens have. So, you know, we had tape and cups on our doors for the overnight. We basically had to hear a knock at our door to allow us to actually leave the room, because, and in all fairness, we had a bathroom in our room, so it's not like if we had to go to the bathroom in the middle of the night, we would have broken the tape or something. Like, we had a bathroom in our own room, and we were permitted to bring snacks to our rooms as well. But like, you know, I feel like that's something else that you hear, is that people will have cups on their doors, or on their door handles, or tape on the latch, so that people know when they left their rooms in the middle of the night. Which I feel like it is very common, but at the same time, like, whenever I went on a high school trip, none of my teachers ever did that. I know of a high school trip actually where we went with a different program, and the other program teacher and parents did that, but our teacher and parents didn't do that, because they were like, all they're gonna do is go to each other's rooms, and it's all a bunch of young girls that are just best friends with one another. Like, none of them, from our knowledge, are romantically interested in one another. So because also all of us, I'm completely getting off the fact of growing up Catholic, but all of us grew up doing competition dance, so we were used to staying in hotel rooms, and a lot of our childhood doing competition dance and going to these hotels was actually going to one another's rooms and and just hanging out with each other a lot. because it was like basically a sleepover, but in a hotel. Bring up Eloise. But yeah, again, I feel like this is a really short episode. But also it's because I don't want to bring up anyone else's stories. I guess I can bring up this one story of my dad's. He tells it to like everyone, so I don't think he would be annoyed if I told it. If he does, then you're gonna see a sudden cut right here. But so my dad, like I said, he grew up going to Catholic school, and he was very involved in sports at his school too. And so he actually was up pretty late one night, and it was around Christmas time, and he was told he had to go to Christmas Eve Mass. Actually, I'm completely telling this story wrong. I'm going to start over. He had never been to Christmas Eve midnight Mass before, because him and his family had always just gone to like the 3 p.m. one, or the early mid-afternoon one. And so admittedly, he is the type of person who will fall asleep in his seat if we're watching a movie after 8 p.m. And so he was being set up for failure, if you will. And so he went to this midnight Mass, and they sat in the second to last pew, and in the last pew was all the nuns. And he kept on like nodding off, and one time he'd nod off so bad that he made the whole pew shake, and a bunch of nuns behind him laughed like really loud. Or I shouldn't say really loud, like it was audible for him to be able to hear. But of course, as I say that story, I have to admit to the one time I did a similar thing. But I admittedly told my parents I wanted to go to a later Mass, because my dance competition, again, here's how it just ties into how I grew up. My dance competition team, around Christmas every single year, we had a lock-in where we basically slept over at the dance studio. It was all the dance teachers, the studio owner actually would go home to go to sleep, but all the dance teachers, all the dancers, and before anyone makes this creepy, like, our dance teachers are literally like some of the most safe people in my life, in my opinion, to have watch over this massive amount of kids. When you're specifically talking about like the things that unfortunately happen sometimes when you have adults that aren't direct parents or guardians watching over kids. Besides the point. But I had basically almost pulled an all-nighter. I think I went to bed at like 4 a.m. that night, and my parents were picking me up at 7 a.m. for church, and like they brought a change of clothes and everything, and I was literally looking them dead in the face. I was like, please, like, I literally barely slept. Like, if I can just go home and sleep for a few more hours and we go to the 10 a.m. Mass, like, I promise you, I will go to the 10 a.m. Mass, even if you just drop me off and pick me back up, because I hadn't been driving yet. Like, please, 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 please. And they were like, no, we have your clothes. We're ready now. We're all going to church. And so admittedly, throughout this whole entire Mass, I was nodding off and doing the same exact thing that my dad did, about 20 years prior. And I think if you ask my parents, they would say now that they should have just let me go home and sleep and go to the 10 a.m. Mass instead. But I, again, just felt absolutely terrible. That is one of the few times I felt terrible while being in church, because I was like, I probably look so terrible to all these other people in the church. People think I'm just like bored, when really I just am lacking sleep as a preteen teenager. I guess that is a good story to kind of end here, because I don't really have that many other stories. Again, I have a lot of family members and friends that have really funny growing up Catholic stories. And I'm sure I probably have others I just can't remember right now. I was trying so hard to remember when I was writing down my sheet for this episode. But if you liked this episode, if you liked any previous episodes, make sure to give a like, subscribe, share the episode. If you're on Spotify, rate it. I'm not going to say rate it 5 stars, rate what you think it deserves, because I know that I have room for improvement personally. But I love you all. You all matter. And I don't know what next week's episode's going to be, but I think it'll definitely have a guest again, because I feel like these episodes where I'm by myself are shorter, just because I don't have as much to talk about and I can only rant to a camera for so long. But